welcome to the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I am joined, as I am every week here, by John Kelly on the Undisputed show. We're going to be talking about UFC Vegas 48 going down this Saturday at the Apex. We got a fight night at light heavyweight between Jamal Hill and Johnny Walker in the main event, a short notice main event, a fight that was bumped up to 5 rounds last week after we lost a previous main event of Fiziev versus Dos Anjos. But we've got 12 fights going down this weekend at the Apex. John, my friend, not the best card on paper that the UFC has ever put together, but hopefully we find some spots, some betting spots for the people, find a little value, get some good action down. And how are you doing, my friend, headed into this fight week following a pay-per-view?
Yeah, I'm doing all right, man. And I do think there is a couple good spots that we can get into this week. Obviously, we got my guy A10, Jim Miller. I'm sure you're going to give me shit about Jim Miller like you always do. But I think there's a couple other good spots as well to attack this week. Fun little DFS slate before the holiday weekend. So let's get into it.
Yes, sir. Let's get into it, my man. First up, first fight of the evening, Mario Bautista comes in as a minus 320 favorite here at $9,200 against short notice replacement Jay Perrin, who comes in plus 250, is a pretty sizable underdog in his UFC debut. He's 7K flat on DraftKings, and Mario Bautista hasn't fought in about 11 months. His last fight, he got knocked out by Trevin Jones. I think Mario Bautista as a fighter is pretty decent. You know, he has a decent amount of output on the feet, throws a good amount, pretty explosive, has some finishing ability even at a lower weight class. Doesn't really offensively wrestle much, which makes it tough to lay this kind of price at 9.2K on DraftKings or even at minus 320 in the betting market. But I will say, John, before we let you get into your breakdown here, I went back, watched some tape on Jay Perrin, and I'm not quite sure that this guy's UFC level. You know what I mean? I mean, a lot of his fights are grappling heavy, but he doesn't seem like he's a great grappler. I saw his last fight, I believe, is against Josh Smith. This is a guy in Perrin who lost on Contender Series like 2 or 3 years ago, has won twice on the regional scene, but even his regional fights where he's 2-0 since losing on Contender Series, he will rock his opponent and then somehow ends up on bottom a few seconds later. He's kick heavy on the feet, but nothing really too impressive. So all in all, I don't really think Jay Perrin's a UFC level fighter. He's taking this fight on a few days' notice. Really tough spot. You know, I don't think Mario Bautista is a great fighter by any stretch, and I'm not really sure I'm going to lay this type of price, but minus 300, minus 350 seems about right here for a guy who we've seen get wins at the UFC level against somebody who probably doesn't belong. So I'll take Mario Bautista in the first fight of the night. I think the biggest question for me is kind of how much I'll use him on DraftKings. John, what are your thoughts here on the first fight, both from a betting and DFS perspective, my friend?
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't see much from Perrin. And you say, you know, I don't know if this guy's UFC level. I have a feeling you're going to be saying that a few times tonight. Just going to go out on a limb and make that my bold prediction for this show. But to your point, like I do think Perrin is not great, but he is at least aggressive and does have a little bit of skill. But I just think his fighting style in general, along with how he matches up with Bautista, I think this is kind of going to be a banger a little bit for as long as Perrin lasts. I do think Bautista is good enough to get a finish here. I do think he's better basically wherever the fight goes. You know, Perrin, while he's able to, you know, make or be a finisher at the lower levels and, you know, bring it to guys, he's very irresponsible defensively. He does look to land takedowns a little bit. I don't think he could really take Bautista down. And Bautista's solid grappling as well. So I just think Bautista's well-rounded enough, more battle-tested, better cardio. I think he's fine here, but I do think this could be a high-paced fight where we do want a little bit of action on it on DraftKings. Now, Bautista is one of the more expensive fighters, so he's not my favorite play because of the price. I do prefer a couple others in that range, but because I do think the fight plays out at a high pace, and I do think Bautista could find a finish, he's in the mix for me for sure.
I think it makes sense. It'll be a little bit of Mario Bautista for me on DraftKings, but not a ton for sure. Let's move on to the second fight of the night. This is an interesting matchup, one that I think will be pretty exciting, both from a DFS perspective and obviously a real life perspective. I expect high pace in this fight, and that's mostly because Jonathan Pierce is fighting. JSP comes into this fight nearly a minus 400 favorite. He's minus 380 currently at DraftKings Sportsbook. He's $9,300 on DraftKings for their DFS product, and he faces UFC newcomer Christian Rodriguez, who's plus 290, $6,900. For Rodriguez, who's undefeated, he's 7-0 as a professional fighter. He closes a significant favorite on Contender Series I thought he fought pretty well in that matchup. Actually, a guy where I do think this guy, Christian Rodriguez, is UFC level. I do think he belongs in the big show. However, this is a tough matchup for him. Rodriguez, primarily a striker, somebody who's most of his grappling is going to be defensive, trying to not get taken down. And I think that's where he might run into some trouble here with Jonathan Pierce, who JSP comes into this fight. He's won 2 consecutive fights inside of the UFC. He's much bigger. At 145 pounds, I will note that Rodriguez is moving up from 135, so on Contender Series, and throughout his whole career, really, as a professional, he fought at 135. His last fight after Contender Series was at 150 for a catch weight. It was like a month ago. But clearly, I think naturally a 135er moving up to 145. JSP is really big for this 145 weight class. Identical reach here, but JSP is about 5 inches of height. I expect him to be the much stronger guy when they kind of lock up in those clinch situations. And look, I like Jonathan Pierce. A ton of output on the feet. He's very hittable defensively, which I don't love, but goes for takedowns early and often. I think he has like 11 takedowns over his last 2 UFC fights. And look, I don't think Rodriguez is bad. I think he'll be able to stuff a few takedowns and maybe have a little bit of marginal success on the feet here, but this is just a tough matchup for a guy making his debut up a weight class against a guy in JSP who is big for the weight class that he's moving into. And look, I just think Jonathan Pierce is a good fighter. Fights with a lot of pace to his game. Will be consistently throwing output. Will shoot takedowns constantly. So I think Pierce gets the job done this weekend. Although maybe the betting odds are a little bit wide, but I'll kind of just pass here. I think Pierce gets the job done relatively easily, and then maybe we'll get a buy low spot on Christian Rodriguez in his second UFC fight or something like that. So, John, your thoughts on Rodriguez kind of as a prospect off a Contender Series, and then also on the fight, obviously.
Yeah, I think you made up a lot of good points there. Rodriguez is a guy who I'm not super impressed with. You know, he looked all right on Contender Series, but the level of competition was certainly not what it is at the UFC. You know, he fought Tracy Cortez's younger brother, Junior Cortez. Or actually, he might be her older brother. I think he's actually her older brother, but he goes by Junior. So it's kind of confusing. But really didn't look all that good. But he did have a little bit of success with his wrestling. And he's much smaller, not as strong as JSP here. JSP's previously fought at 155 before. He's massive for this weight class. You know, I just think the size is going to be huge here, and JSP is a guy who we backed multiple times on the show. He's generally underrated in the market. You know, now we see him finally getting a little bit of respect as a big favorite here, but I think it's warranted. Like, he can literally win this fight wherever the fight goes. I think he's a better striker, more powerful. I think he's going to move forward. He's super aggressive, relentless style cardio, and the wrestling is big here. I just think he's going to put a pace on Rodriguez. Rodriguez coming in on short notice, hasn't been tested at this level, trains out of Rufus Sports. So, I mean, he is in the gym with a couple decent guys, but I really see this being a super difficult matchup for him here. So I like JSP, and he's a pretty solid play on DraftKings as well, because he's kind of like that Billy Q mold where they're just going to put a pace on people. And that generally translate to a high scoring DraftKings points, because they're just doing so much, whether it's nonstop striking, multiple takedowns, chasing a finish. And JSP, most of his fights have ended inside the distance. So this is another one where he's expensive, but I think it's warranted, and he's definitely worth some exposure on DraftKings.
I agree. He's probably worth paying up for. I believe in his 2 wins in terms of DFS scoring, he scored like 123 points and then 134 points. I tried to pull that up while you were talking, but I had it written in my notes. You know, this is a guy who, when he wins, which we obviously expect him to do as a minus 400 favorite this weekend, someone with a real serious ceiling in terms of DFS. And I think we probably see that this weekend. So sounds like we're on the same page for the first 2 fights. Let's move on to the third fight of the night, John. I know you have a bet on this fight. We got Chan and Helliger. He's minus Chad, I should say, and Helliger minus 250, $9,100 on DraftKings against Jesse Strader. Comes back plus 200, 7.1K for Strader. And Strader, we've seen before. He took a fight against Montel Jackson, I believe on short notice, did not last very long in that one before getting knocked out. But John, I wanted to let you go first here. This is a Dana White Contender Series alum and Helliger, someone who I know that I actually watched this fight on Contender Series live. It was one of the few fights I caught this year, but I know that this is kind of your wheelhouse with the guys coming up with Contender Series. You've already put in the work. So curious your thoughts on Helliger going into his UFC debut, and also just the matchup in general against Jesse Strader.
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting, because I actually bet against Chad and Helliger on Dana White Contender Series. I don't lay chalk often. You know that. It's one thing that I'm trying to get better at within the past couple months, is where I do think somebody, it is kind of an expensive price to pay, but if they're going to look like a massive favorite, then I should probably just pay that. And that's kind of what I thought with the Contender Series fight. Chad Anheliger fought Muin Gafarov, who I honestly, maybe it was one of my worst reads. I thought Gafarov was like a legitimate fighter that was going to at least make a splash in the UFC. Obviously, I was proven wrong, but he just didn't look as good as he previously did. He looked out of shape a little bit. You know, the cardio was certainly a factor, but he did have a lot of success with the wrestling. And Helliger will give up takedowns. He'll pull guillotine. He actually does have a nice guillotine, which I think could be a weapon here against Jesse Strader. But this is another fight where I think it's probably going to get a little bit sloppy because it's so low level, and both guys fight kind of reckless. Both guys are decently aggressive. I did bet fight doesn't start round 3 at minus 120. It's a little bit off market. FanDuel still has that. It's about 20 cents off market from what I saw. Based on what else you can get it at. But I just think this fight is generally dictates a finish here. And Helliger, I believe it's 14 of his 16 fights have ended inside the distance. Strader's only fought 7 times, but all 6 of those 7 did not reach the 3rd round. So just the way these guys fight, like Strader is going to be aggressive. He's going to move forward, but he's super reckless. He plays like no defense, leaves his head just wide open to be countered by whatever you want to throw. And we saw Anheliger have success with knees in the clinch against Gafarov on Contenders. That's a big opening for him here against Strader. I also think that the guillotine is a weapon with the way that Strader fights. And if he's, maybe he gets hurt on the feet and looks for a takedown, he just leaves his neck out there. And like I said, Anheliger does have a solid guillotine. So I think the finish likely comes from the Anheliger side, which kind of pains me to say because I really don't think this guy is very good. Bet against him on Contender Series. I think we're going to have future spots to get bet against him as well. I really don't know if Strader's the guy, so I'd rather just make a violence bet here. So fight doesn't start round 3, minus 120 is what I played for a unit on FanDuel, and I'll probably have some exposure to both sides on DraftKings.
Yeah, I like the take there, especially the DFS part at the end where you'll have exposure to both sides. This is a fight that I haven't made a bet on yet, although I think there's a compelling case to be made that actually was just made by you, John, for the under here. Sounds like FanDuel has a pretty good price. That doesn't start round 3. You mentioned minus 120 there. I think that's probably good. I might bet it after the show. My read here is pretty similar to yours. In terms of the money line here, I think the price is maybe a little bit wide, and a guy in Chad Anheliger, who I don't necessarily think is like a super great UFC level prospect, but I know for a fact that Jesse Strader is not UFC level, and that's not only because he lost to a tough guy in Montel Jackson. You just go back and watch his regional tape, a guy who isn't super durable. He does a good job ripping to the body, actually. That was something that was in my notes prior to his debut. That's like the one thing that I think he does really well. Does Strader. He goes to the body pretty early and often, but it's just kind of outmatched everywhere, I think, against most guys in the promotion. So we'll see if Chad is UFC level this weekend, if he gets the win here, or maybe we'll look to fade him in a second fight. But I do think he deserves to be a favorite. I think violence is probably the way here when we get 2 guys who are kind of defensively void, low level fight. Should be looking to put on a show. So I do like the look there on an under. I'll have exposure to both sides on DK. Probably more Chad, but at the same time, there's also guys like JSP. Like I want to play a lot of Pierce, and he's the most expensive fighter on the slate at 9.3K. So I don't know how much Anheliger I'll get to in the end, but a fight that I think the winner will score well in. So I'll pick Chad as well, but not a spot that I feel super confident, at least in terms of the money line. Let's move on to the next fight here. We got Diana Belbita. She's a minus 120 favorite currently against Gloria De Paula, who comes back plus 100 and even money underdog. DK prices here right down the middle, 8.2K and 8K respectively on the fighters. And I won't spend too long giving my take for this fight, John. I think we both have done a decent job outlining, cases for some of these lesser known fighters, lesser known fights, kind of ways that we can find value. This is a lesser known fight that I really don't think I have a valuable opinion on. I think first thing to be noted here is both girls are really poor grapplers. Like Belbita has been taken down 7 times in her 2 UFC fights that have gone the distance and was like pretty much immediately submitted by Liana Jojua in her other fight that didn't go the distance. And Jojua has since been cut. She hasn't faced great grapplers either. It's like Hannah Goldie and who took her down 5 times in her debut. Was it? I think Molly McCann took her. Yeah, Molly McCann took her down 5 times. So just a really poor grappler. And the same could be said for Gloria De Paula, who looked good on Contender Series, kind of facing a walking punching bag that didn't take her down. I got sucked into the hype. I laid some chalk on her against Jin Yu Frey in her UFC debut, and she kind of got the veteran lesson there. But I don't know. I think that both girls really poor grapplers. That's the first thing to be said. De Paula got knocked out her last fight by Cheyenne Vilsmas on the feet, but I don't think that that's going to be like, I think Cheyenne is way better than Belbita on the feet. That said, I do think it makes sense to have Belbita as a minus 120 favorite. We've seen her go out there, land 120, 125 significant strikes before. We know she's capable of putting up a high pace in a kickboxing fight and winning decisions at the UFC level. And with Paula, I'm just not totally sure that she has that sort of upside. So I expect the fight to stay standing. I know there was some media day stuff with Gloria where she was saying she was going to come in here and wrestle. I'll believe it when I see it, and it's possible she does, but I'm not even sure she'll have success. Like, she's that poor of a defensive grappler that I don't imagine her offensive wrestling will be that good, but it should be pretty much a shit show in my opinion, this fight. So no real strong take. I already spoke too long about it. I'll pick Belbita. I think minus 120 is pretty accurate, and no action for me here. John, anything I missed on this fight? Anything that the people need to know about between Belbita and De Paula?
No, I really don't have a ton to add. I echo a lot of your thoughts there. I earlier in the week, I thought I might play Belbita if the line kept coming in. For some reason, people were backing De Paula. It was one-way traffic early in the week, and then it was, I think, down to a pick 'em, and I'm like, give me a little plus money, I'll get involved on Belbita, but it just didn't happen. We saw some buyback. Now she's like minus 122 or something. It might even be worse than that, but I just think this is an ugly, low-level women's MMA fight that you probably don't need to have any action on. I do lean towards Belbita just because I expect her to be more aggressive. I expect her to throw a lot more volume, and I think she has better cardio. So with that being said, I do think De Paula hits hard. If she has one thing going, she's a powerful boxer. Her grappling, like you said, is pretty low level, but maybe she's been working on the wrestling. I know she said that, like you alluded to. And I don't think either girl really has much wrestling, so it's not like I can say like one, well, if so-and-so goes for takedowns, like I really think both of them could probably land a takedown just because they're both so poor defensively. But I think primarily we see a striking match here. I slight lean towards Belbita on just volume, aggression, and I think she has better cardio. But outside of that, I'm just not going to have really any action on this fight.
Makes sense to me. We can move on here. We got a pretty interesting fight that should feature a lot of grappling, and I'm kind of curious your takes here. We got Chaz Skelly minus 200, 8.7K, coming off of a pretty decent layoff. I think it's been about 2.5 years since he's actually been in the cage and had a fight go down. We know there was that time where he got in the cage and who wasn't able to make the walk? Jamal Emmers had like back spasms. Yeah, and then he couldn't make the walk. So we haven't seen Chaz Skelly in action inside of an octagon since September of 2019. He is a minus 200 favorite here, despite that, against Mark Striegel, who comes back plus 170 to Striegel. He's 7.5K. On DraftKings, and Mark Striegel, it's a similar situation where he got in the cage. He just got blown out in 51 seconds against Said Nurmagomedov in his UFC debut. And prior to that, this is a guy who hadn't fought since 2019 either, I believe. So two guys where there's just not a ton of tape on either one of them within recent years. So kind of going off some, we got to assume a few things about how they're doing, especially on the Chaz Skelly side. Chaz, never the most athletic guy, I will say, and he's 36 years old at this point. Striegel is also not a super young guy either in terms of the MMA world. He's 33. So interesting matchup, John. I'll let you go first with your breakdown here. Should feature to see a lot of grappling. All of Mark Striegel's wins by inside the distance wins, I should say. 14 of his 18 total wins have come via submission. And with Chaz Skelly, this is a guy who's been in the UFC a long time. We know his game plan is always to grapple as well. So I figure we'll see a lot of grappling. Who do you think kind of has the edge in that aspect of the fight? And then obviously overall your thoughts on the betting market.
Yeah, this is an interesting matchup because on one hand, we have a guy who we know is a good grappler in Chaz Skelly, comes from a collegiate wrestling background. But at the same time, like you mentioned, the long layoff, I don't even want to talk about that Jamal Emmers fight because for those that don't remember, it happened after the slate locked on DraftKings, and then they made an announcement on air, Chaz Skelly's in the cage. Jamal Emmers never comes out. And they're like, oh, yeah, he had back spasms. He's not coming out. And he was like 40% owned on DraftKings or whatever. So it just tanked a bunch of lineups. But yeah, the long layoff for Chaz Skelly, he's already talked about, this might be his retirement fight. I believe he turns 37 later this year. So he is getting up there. The last time we have seen him, and really the last couple times we've seen him, he hasn't looked that great. So when you see him at above minus 200 or whatever, immediately, you should be starting to look if you want to back the other side. And as much as I like Striegel, You know, a few years back, I believe I was texting you like Striegel's my boy, he's making his UFC debut. It was a fight that he ended up pulling out because he tested positive for COVID a couple years ago. I can't remember who he was set to face, but I'm like, you know, he's got some skills. You know, while he's definitely going to be not the better. Go ahead.
It was Timur Valiev, and he was like plus 400.
That's what
and
it was.
Before Valiev debuted, I think, and he just like fought in PFL or something like that.
Yep.
And you were all over it, but the fight obviously never came to fruition.
Yep, and you know what? I'll just take my Sklansky bucks there because I do think the fade was there on Valiev. But yeah, so he was 2019 Sambo gold medalist at the 2019 Southeast Asian Games. So he does have, you know, some good wrestling, Sambo background, decent enough grappler. But I do think Skelly's just kind of better. It's just a question of Skelly's older. The cardio is not good. While the striking isn't good, neither is Striegel's. So it's not even like I have like a strong take on who's going to win the striking. Striegel has never knocked out anybody in his career. So like you said, I think we see a lot of grappling here. And while I think Skelly is better and I think he'll have more favorable positions early in the fight, I really question the age drop off. The cardio hasn't been there either. Like even the Jordan Griffin fight, like it wasn't pretty at times. And Striegel's a good enough athlete with solid submission skills. Like if he takes over late, I wouldn't be surprised. So I'd consider him a live underdog here, but I just don't have enough interest to back him, even though I could see myself being like watching this fight play out and then be like, why didn't I just back Striegel? Because it looks like Skelly kind of fell off a cliff. But I'm still going to go with the veteran here. It's just not a confident lean because there are so many question marks with the long layoff. He's getting old, possibly retiring, and he hasn't looked good even when we saw him 2.5 years ago. So what's he going to look like on Saturday night?
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's certainly a lot of question marks in this matchup. Like that is kind of the primary thing I'm trying to make known here is that I think it's hard to trust either guy. That being said, I do think that Skelly at minus 200, you know, it's hard to lay that type of price. And I'm not interested in laying it, period, just on the money line. But I do think he obviously has a skill. Like if he gets him down, if he gets Striegel down in the first round, like I think Skelly is a way better submission grappler, probably even a better wrestler overall. And I think he has a chance to cover a minus 200 price tag. However, I think I might be more interested in an under. You know, I've been trying to figure out how to play this fight. There's a good chance that I just pass in totality because there's not a ton of tape recently. We don't really know what's going to happen to both guys, but a way that you can kind of embrace the volatility of not seeing a fighter in 2.5 years or dealing with a fighter like Skelly, who never had great cardio and is now 36 years old. A great way to embrace volatility in MMA is just to play the under because him being totally washed and getting knocked down in the first round is live. Him being his old self and being able to just dominate Mark Striegel positionally is live. And all those things lead you to an under. So I'm a little bit tempted to play an under in this spot. I also like the fight ends by submission at plus 130. I think that's kind of the most obvious way we see a finish in this spot would be via submission from either guy. So I favor Skelly, especially early on in the fight. I think he's going to get to pretty dominant positions, and I think he'll be able to finish the fight once he gets there. But hard to trust him at this time, considering he hasn't fought in a long time. And when we have seen him fight, it hasn't exactly inspired a ton of confidence these days. So I'll pass on the money line. Maybe it ends by sub plus 130, but try not to force action on a card where I just don't think there's a ton of valuable spots to be had. But I've made a few bets already. I will talk next up about, I think my biggest bet on the card fight is Jessica Rose Clark. She's minus 180. She's $8,600 on DK against Stephanie Edgar, who comes back plus 155, 7.6K for Edgar. And I'll go first here. I played this fight to go to decision, and I'll go kind of through my process on that play specifically. Just want to give a background real quick, as we always do on both fighters. You know, Jessica Rose Clark, I think, is a solid UFC fighter at this point. Her stats check out pretty well offensively striking. She's been putting up a good pace. Isn't a walking punching bag on the feet. Her grappling is looking improved, I would say. At least her wrestling, I should say, is looking improved. She landed a career high 5 takedowns her last time out against Jocelyn Edwards. But I will say, going back and rewatching the fight, I didn't think that Jessica Rose Clark looked quite as, I don't want to say dominant as I remember, because I didn't think she looked dominant. But I remember a lot of people were complaining like the fight was boring, and I just kind of thought she did a really good job nullifying her opponent. But John, maybe you'll have an opinion on this when I kick to you. But to me, when I went back and watched the Jocelyn Edwards fight, it was like she had kind of weird takedown entry. She got her to the ground, but that's kind of because Jocelyn Edwards is someone who's willing to be on her back and throw up submissions. So I think Jessica Rose Clark might run into a little more trouble than that fight in terms of the grappling here. You know, Stephanie Edgar has a judo background, not super experience in MMA, but does have a judo background. She's someone who's pretty strong for the weight class. I know these girls um, have a pretty similar size in terms of their height, but Stephanie Edgar is like a 4-inch reach advantage. Her striking is pretty poor. That's where I really think Jessica Rose Clark has the advantage here is her striking, but Edgar works behind her jab okay, which she can do due to her reach and size advantage in this weight class. But I like the goes the distance here. I'll pick Jessica Rose Clark on the money line, but kind of my plays. I played minus 170. I think it was earlier today, minus 170 for a unit and a half. I just have trouble getting to that low of a number. It's not a spot where I looked at it kind of from a subjective point of view early in the week. And I was like, oh, I definitely want to play the goes the distance in Edgar versus Rose Clark. But I was just kind of going through numbers. That seemed way short to me. Jessica Rose Clark has 6 UFC fights. 5 of them have gone the distance. The only one that didn't was against Sarah Alpar, where she finished her. And then Stephanie Edgar, on the other hand, her only UFC finish is over Shayna Young, who Shayna Young and Sarah Alpar, the 2 girls who they've finished, are really poor bottom of the barrel fighters. And neither Jessica Rose Clark nor Stephanie Edgar has ever been finished in their UFC careers on the losing end. So kind of just struggle to see how a finish would come here. I guess Jessica Rose Clark, a standing KO possible. She's a better striker, but it's hard to get standing KOs in women's MMA, especially at like a minus 170 price. It's not like minus 300, minus 400. And the grappling, like I expect Edgar to be bigger. I wouldn't be surprised if she gets a judo toss or two, but she's not someone who I think is going to like finish the fight or be super vicious on top, despite the fact that she had a ground and pound finish last time out. So long-winded way to say I laid the chalk here on the goes the distance minus 170 for a unit and a half. I'll pick Jessica Rose Clark, but not really inspired to bet anything on the money line. John, any interest from you here and really any market? Curious your thoughts on the fight.
No, I definitely don't have as strong of a take as you. I would lean that this does go the distance. You're basically just fading like an Edgar armbar, Edgar submission, in my opinion. Like I don't really see a knockout on either side. I do think Edgar is probably getting a little bit slept on just because she hasn't looked great at the UFC level. I know she got the stoppage against Shayna Young, but let's be honest, like, I mean, who didn't see that coming? And that one, I'll brag a little bit because Shayna Young is like one of the worst to ever do it in WMMA. So we were definitely on the Edgar side there, but yeah, outside of that, Edgar hasn't looked great, but I do think she at least has some skills. You mentioned the judo background. She is, big for this division. Rose Clark, I think, is probably strong enough to compete in the grappling, but I'm just not convinced that she's technical enough. So I do have some concerns with her there. Overall, I do lean her way just ever so slightly, just because I think she has a very clear striking advantage. And if Edgar can't get into the clinch and can't get the fight to the ground, then I think she's she's got an uphill battle to climb, but it's not a strong take either way. I lean Clark. I'll probably have a little bit of Edgar on DraftKings, but overall it's mostly a pass for me and no bet either way. So I'll just be rooting that it goes the full 15 minutes for you.
Appreciate that. Let's move on to the next fight of the week. One that is on the prelims. I believe we haven't reached the main card yet. I think it's a 5-fight main card this weekend. So last fight on the prelims, but certainly the most debated fight, at least on the MMA Twitter street so far this week. We got David Onama, currently a minus 150 favorite. He's $8.4 thousand on DraftKings against my guy Gabriel Mowgli Benitez, who comes back plus 130, $7.8 thousand on DK. And John, I see you already smirking over there. I'm going to let you go first here. David Onama, a guy who came in big underdog, short notice spot against Mason Jones, was competitive, but I thought clearly lost the fight. Now getting a lot of market respect against a guy in Gabriel Benitez, who has a lot of quality UFC wins, established kickboxer on the feet, but is coming off of a pretty significant beating against Billy Q about 6-7 months ago. So I'm curious your thoughts. Onama, a lot of market respect, goes from a big underdog and a guy, Mason Jones, who's a highly touted prospect, to now being minus 150 against the guy who has a bunch of UFC wins. So I'm curious, do you think the market has gone too far? Are you finally hopping on my boy Gabriel Benitez, or is this a spot where you kind of think Onama justifies his price at minus 150, John?
Yeah, well, first, I was laughing because we have, on one hand, we have my guy, Jim Miller, on the card, who you always make fun of me for because I just bet him every time he fights. And then we have your boy, Benitez, who every time he's on the card, you have a bet on him. Yep. So I'm excited to hear your to see if you have a bet, because I haven't looked yet, but I'm just assuming that you do. It's just a blind bet. But I do lean towards the veteran, even at least in terms of where the value is on the money line. I think Onama, I don't have a strong read overall because Onama has some skills. I do think he's being a little bit overvalued, and that's why I'm kind of cautious with my approach towards him, is because, everyone's hyping him up because he gave a hell of a fight to Mason Jones, actually outlanded him in that fight, obviously gave up a ton of takedowns in that fight, but his cardio looked good on short notice, trains at a good camp in Glory with head coach James Krause. He does have some power in his hands. That was actually, I believe, the first time he's fought to a decision, but he looked fine in doing that. The rest of his wins have come inside the distance, was previously undefeated before that. Now, all that being said, Benitez, you mentioned it, technical kickboxer. I don't know if some young prospect is just going to come out here and outstrike him at range. Like I kind of find that hard to believe. But the downside of Benitez and what worries me and why I haven't backed Benitez, maybe you can talk me into it, is I do think we've seen a bit of a decline in Benitez over his last couple fights. And I know like early on in his career, like one of the hardest kickers, probably still is one of the hardest kickers in the division. But it just seems like the pace has slowed down a little bit. The defense hasn't been as sharp, and he seems to be getting hurt a lot more. Like even not even the fights where he gets knocked out, but even some of the ones where he didn't, his legs beat up, his face is beat up, he's cut open. And then obviously we saw the last fight, Billy Q just put a hell of a pace on him. I'm not going to fault him too much for that, but one that was kind of surprising to me is the Omar Morales fight. I don't think many people were expecting Omar Morales to, basically outstrike him for the majority of that fight. So it's like, I think Onama could be the aggressor. I think he can push forward, and that's one thing I don't think Benitez does well at this stage in his career, is deal well with pressure. But at the same time, like you mentioned, he's much more battle tested against a guy who is young, who is still improving, but hasn't fought at this level outside of a punching bag in Mason Jones. So it could just be a levels thing where Benitez just gives him the old vet lesson. That wouldn't surprise me, but it's just the decline that's giving me pause, the decline in durability. He used to kind of be pretty durable, and now he's been knocked out a few times, and like I said, he's been seemingly getting hurt in almost every fight. So it's like I feel like my head is saying he's the value side, but my heart is saying he gets hurt again or just looks bad and loses. I don't know. So maybe you can talk me into it. I'm assuming you have a bet on your boy Benitez.
Yeah, I hate to disappoint, but I don't have a bet on Gabriel Benitez this weekend, and I'm picking against him. I will take David Onama in this fight. I do think it's an interesting matchup. I'll start by saying I could never bet Onama at minus 150. If you got him on the opener, where I actually considered betting him, I think it was like minus 120, became kind of widely available a week or two ago. I was tempted at those prices. If you got in, I obviously think you did a good job in the market. Clearly agrees with your play there, as it's moved about 30 cents since the open, but would never lay it with David Onama at minus 150, right? Like, this is a guy who has one UFC fight to a short notice. He fought great. At the same time, like, there were some red flags, got taken down like 8 or 9 times, was controlled for almost 2/3 of the fight. So it's tough for me to lay that kind of price on a guy who's a prospect against someone as established as Benitez is. That said, I'm having trouble getting actual money down on Gabriel Benitez and feeling confident that I'm getting in on the right side, man. John, you mentioned like the damage he's taking is serious. I'll say I had a max bet 3 units on Gabriel Benitez at plus 115 against Billy Q. He closed like minus 160 in that spot. Like, the market clearly agreed that the opener was wrong. I got down a good amount on it. I felt confident. I actually got down so much that I even arbed out a little bit on the other side just because I thought the number was so bad. And, Benitez fought back well in that fight, but if you just watched the first round, like, got hurt pretty early on and pretty obviously like never recovers throughout. And he's just someone who I feel like, outside of the fight against who was it, Justin James, who we really just beat the crap out of, like, he seems to be getting hurt in a lot of fights, a couple of fights where obviously the one against Billy Q, where he got hurt a lot of times, like the Omar Morales fight, he had an injury on his leg throughout that one. And that's not something that sticks with you for a super long time. But like, I feel like Benitez might be slowing down a little bit, and he's someone who kind of always benefited, I thought, from being quick. I still think he presents some problems for Onama. Like, Onama's a green fighter still. We can't forget that. Benitez is like a tricky kicker out of the southpaw stance, like not a prototype you see super often, especially coming up on the regional scene. So I think it's a tough fight for Onama, but at the same time, man, like, it's easy to say in hindsight. John, you mentioned like Mason Jones is a punching bag. Like, yeah, Mason Jones gets hit a lot, but Mason Jones also has like quality UFC wins, has gone out there and like looks like he's the real deal. Like, do I think he's going to be a future champ? Probably not, but someone who I think could be, top 10, top 15. I don't want to put in too much stock into a guy in Onama who still lost the fight, but he's clearly game. He clearly belongs at this level. So I think him being a small favorite makes sense. Price right now, probably accurate, maybe even a little bit too high on the Onama side, but not to the point where I'm really getting in on a Benitez bet. So it's my boy. I'll be rooting for Mowgli, but I honestly think he's going to have a tough time this weekend against the athleticism. Like just the pure athleticism difference between these two guys is kind of crazy, especially if we consider that Benitez looks like he's kind of physically deteriorating a little bit. So as much as I love to back my guy, I'm passing this fight. And John, unless you've got anything to add, I'm sorry to let you down, but unless you got anything to add, we can move on to the main card here.
Yeah, I'm a little bummed, but for those that are listening, if literally the biggest Benitez backer in the entire country is saying not to bet him and considered betting the other side, that's a red flag emoji if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, for real. And it seems like a lot of people like Benitez this weekend, at least from people kind of in my circle I've been talking to. So wish them good luck, obviously, but I will not be hopping on the train this weekend. Let's move on to the main card here for UFC Vegas 48. We got 5 fights left to go. First one up is one that we actually both have a bet on, John, and it's actually on opposite sides. So we got Joaquin Buckley, minus 160 is an $8.3 thousand fighter on DraftKings. He takes on Abdul Razak Alhassan, who comes back plus 140, 7.9K. And John, I saw you had a play on a prop here. The props for you, man, I feel horrible looking through the bet tracker. It feels like every week you got like these plus 500, plus 600 bets on the prop market. And like they're like ends by KO and someone just gets the absolute snot beat out of them. It's 30-26. And the bet doesn't cash. It somehow goes to decision. And I don't just say those things. It's like we all make good bets and bad bets, but like it feels to me, and I'm not just covering for you, that you've like taken some rough beats in the prop market. I know you're going back swinging for a plus 550 in this fight on Abdul Razak Alhassan. Tell the people kind of how you're approaching this fight and your breakdown for how you see it playing out on Saturday night.
Yeah, first, you aren't lying, man. I feel like I've been running so cold with props. And obviously, like, I'm pretty certain last year we ran a little bit hot, so you can't complain too much. But I do think that was closer to what it should be. And it's like now, almost every time a long shot, it's like if it's a sub, the round ends and they get saved by the bell. Right. It's like, some vicious beatdown with 4 knockdowns, but nobody gets knocked out and like stuff like that. But it's not going to stop the confidence. I'm going to keep swinging, like you said. I bet Alhassan by first round knockout at plus 500 on FanDuel. And while I don't think Alhassan is, he's clearly been exposed multiple times now. We know what we've always known is he is first round knockout or complete bust. And that cardio falls off a cliff even faster when he's forced to defensively wrestle and grapple. I don't know if Buckley's going to do that. And I don't think that he is. So it's one of those things where, coming off a first round knockout, and by the way, 11 knockout wins on his record, all of his wins have come by first round knockout. That's going to be the way he wins if he wins. Now he's fighting a guy in Buckley who should give him a striking match after getting multiple fights, Malkoun, Laziz, other people that forced him to wrestle and took the wind out of his sails early on. So he didn't really have those moments or those opportunities to land that big power shot early. I think Buckley's going to give him at least an opportunity. I think this is going to be a striking match for the most part. Alhassan hits hard. Obviously, Buckley does too, but Buckley also has kind of a suspect chin. So for a guy that's going to give him a striking match and what he wants, who does have a little bit of suspect durability, I think you could do a lot worse than a plus 500 shot on Alhassan round 1 knockout. So I played it for a half unit. Not a big confident lean for me because he's burned us so many times, but I'm always going to look just to those spots where it's like the money line's plus 125 when like literally almost the only way he wins here is a first round knockout, and that's plus 500. It's a pretty big gap there. I think there's at least a little bit of value there. So that's the way I played it. Obviously on DraftKings, you could play either guy. I think either guy can win by knockout. And I think honestly, Buckley probably does win. It's just that if Alhassan wins, I'm very confident it happens by first round knockout.
Yeah. So what if I told you that I kind of agree with everything? Not even kind of. I agree with literally everything you said, and I somehow found a valuable bet on the other side. I actually think that if you're going to bet the Alhassan side, getting it in round 1 KO makes sense. You mentioned all the reasons. I don't have to repeat them, but basically the guy has 5 UFC wins. They're all 5 by KO1. What's more interesting about this guy is in those fights that have left the first round, he's 0-3 in decisions in the UFC. And on my scorecards, I know he has a split decision on his record against Omari Akhmedov. On my scorecards, he's lost every fight 30-27 that's gotten out of the first round. And we know he got knocked out in the first round one time himself against Chaos Williams. But what I played here is I played the decision-only market on DraftKings Joaquin Buckley minus 115. So if the fight ends inside the distance, which I expect, and John, I think you expect as well, I push my wager. So I'm expecting to push this bet. But if we do hit the scorecards, I have a minus 115 ticket on Joaquin Buckley. And I don't see how this fight is a pick 'em when you hit the cards. Joaquin Buckley, I think, is 3-1 on indecisions in his MMA career as a pro. Obviously hasn't been 1 in the UFC, but Alhassan is 0-3 in decisions, hasn't really been competitive in any decisions, in my opinion. So I think he's very much KO1 or bust. I think Buckley is not someone who I necessarily think is going to win a ton of decisions in the UFC, but certainly the busier fighter, I think, has some wrestling upside, although I'm not really sure he's going to go to that part of his game in this matchup. He did land a takedown his last time out. It's a spot where I think there's no way that if we hit the scorecards, I don't think there's any chance that we'll be going into that last commercial break between the round 3 and Bruce Buffer announcing the winner, where I think it's going to be a 50-50 fight. I think Buckley is like at least a 60, maybe even 70% favorite there. So I've made him a way bigger favorite than this, like when I make my lines prior to looking at the market. And sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. It's not necessarily like a huge part of my process, but I thought Buckley would be like to minus 300 in this market. So I regress my number a little bit back to the market just because I think it's weird, even to win by decision, that prop overall, they're both like plus 500 on either guy to win by decision. I don't see how those could really ever be equal. You know, Alhassan needs that knockout in round 1. And if he doesn't get it, I'm almost positive he's going to lose the fight. So played minus 115 for 2 units here. I expect the bet to push, but hopefully Buckley hurts him in rounds 2 or 3, or really hopefully Alhassan knocks him out in round 1. Then I push and you get your money, John. And if not, then we'll just hope Buckley doesn't get him out of there in this fight. It's the scorecards, and I'll take my win on the 2 units decision only. So similar thought process, John, but obviously on opposite sides. But I think the way we got there is pretty much the same.
Yeah, and that's a really good number too. Somebody else shouted that out, I think, on a show on the Magic and Andrew Gomez show earlier. Somebody in the chat was like, decision only. And I was like, yeah, that's a good number. And I knew you were on that as well. It's a great number. And so what we'll do is we'll root for Alhassan knocked out early. And then if it doesn't happen, which he'll probably get a knockdown and then Buckley will survive, knowing my luck, then it goes to round 2. And then we're just hoping that it goes to decision and we know Buckley will win it. So for those that don't have any rooting interest, that's what we're rooting for. But yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, that's the Undisputed Show special right there. You can switch it up in the middle of the fight who you're rooting for. Let's move on. We got 4 more fights to go. And John, we talked about my boy Gabriel Benitez, who I don't have a bet on this weekend. Let's talk about your boy Jim Miller, who I think you do have a bet on this weekend. A10 currently a plus 150 underdog. He's 7.7K. Against UFC newcomer, a guy who has been waiting to make his debut for what feels like forever now. Nicholas Mota won on Contender Series last year. He's minus 170 coming into his debut fight. He's $8,500 on DK. Originally, this fight was scheduled, I believe Jim Miller pulled out due to COVID, but Jim Miller was a small favorite. The fight was about a pick 'em. Now, following Jim Miller's most recent win, where he won against, I believe, Eric Gonzalez was the kid's name. He won. There were moments that looked sketchy. Now he's a plus 150 underdog to Mota, despite the fact that Mota hasn't fought since the first fight was announced. So interesting line movement here. John, the floor is yours, my friend. Talk to me about why you're backing Jim Miller this weekend.
Yeah, I don't understand the line movement, obviously. Like, I just think Jim Miller is probably gonna style on this kid, honestly. Like, as much as like a 40-year-old not very athletic dude can style on a young prospect who hits hard, like, I think that's what's gonna happen here. Like, Jim Miller, it's no secret I love Jim Miller, but also, like, this is a very winnable matchup. I'm not just saying that because I like the guy. I'm saying that because this is a very winnable matchup for him. I expect him to land takedowns here against Mota. Basically, the only thing about Mota is that he's a decent boxer that hits hard, and he's honestly not even that great of a striking. Like, I think Jim Miller is super competitive in the striking as well. Mota doesn't play a lot of defense, but it's the defensive wrestling and the grappling. And when you're facing a guy like Jim Miller, who we know the game plan is so clear, he's going to come in here, he's going to get the fight to the ground, he's going to have a massive advantage when the fight does hit the mat. So I played Jim Miller by first round submission, plus 800 for half a unit, and then I backed him at the money line at plus 144 for a unit as well. And the reason I did that is because I don't even think Jim Miller's drawing dead to a decision. You know, everybody knows Jim Miller doesn't have much cardio, and maybe that's why his game plan is typically like, hey, I'm gonna get this fight to the ground any way possible and look to get a sub because I know I can't go 15 minutes, but I don't think he has to go 15 minutes here. I think he just needs a solid 10. And the way that he does that is by just landing a takedown. I really don't think Mota can get up. Like if Jim Miller takes him down, I think that's probably a round right there. So it's like, yes, I know Miller doesn't have good cardio, but he could lay on this dude for 10 minutes and then just try to survive the last 5. So it's like, I don't think he's drawing dead to a decision. So that's why I backed him at the money line as well. And also, even though he doesn't show off the hands much, you saw in the last fight, like he specifically was trying for a knockout, and he did get it. And it's possible he could just knock him out as well. Obviously, I don't think that happens, and I'm hoping that he just goes to the safest route, is the grappling, where he has the biggest edge, and I think he will. But at plus 800, he has 18 submission victories, 13 of which have come inside the first round. It's just such a clear path to victory for him here. So yeah, I think he's the best bet on the card. Backed him at the money line, and then half a unit on first round sub at plus 800.
I like the breakdown for the fight. I kind of find myself in a similar boat to you. I think I put a little more stock into the Gonzalez performance than you do in terms of Jim Miller. He won the fight, but was clearly rocked in round 1. And Jim Miller, kind of the story of the last 3-5 years of him has been, he's a fast starter in round 1. He's capable of getting pretty much any non-elite fighter out of there early on, but he's basically fought the who's who in this weight class. He's 38 years old. We know he's struggled with Lyme disease throughout his entire career, and he's someone who has historically slowed down, but I think that's kind of been amplified later on in his career, and someone who struggles to win in rounds 2 and 3. John, it sounds to me like you gave him a little more credit to win some of the later rounds, or at least be competitive in round 3 and win round 2 than we have kind of thought about his most recent fights. I do think Jim Miller early props are good, like plus 600 round 1 on FanDuel. I'll probably bet that for half unit. It's just the guy is such a massive sample of Jim Miller being a fast starter. We just know he's going to come out there against a kid. First fight could be octagon jitters. Jim Miller's coming out there. He's looking to take your head off and finish you in round 1. So I think that's an interesting way to play Miller. I'm not super impressed with Mota's game. Like, he's a decent boxer, doesn't have a ton of killer instinct, like kind of hurt his opponent early on Contender Series, wasn't able to get him out of there. A bunch of fights where I think of his 12 wins, 8 are by knockout. We just look at the guy, and I'm not saying he's not capable of knocking out an old Jim Miller. I'm just saying he's not someone who historically hunts down a finish. So originally I was tempted to play the fight doesn't go to decision at like minus 130. The line has kind of moved since then, but I've also kind of cooled on the take. Like, I think if Miller has a good round 1 and then slows down, I'm not even sure it's a foregone conclusion that Mata's going to be able to put him out of there. We've seen Jim Miller last until that final bell, even in some fights like the Vince Pichel fight where he was struggling late on, Scott Holtzman, even the Selecki fight, where the Selecki fight was not like as high pace and not as wasn't as much in danger where I thought he was going to get finished down the stretch. But Jim Miller is a tough guy even when he does slow down. So I don't really think the under is as good as I originally thought it was. I'll probably just play some Jim Miller early. Another way to play this, I think, if you don't want to take the plus 600 prop, is I think just the scorecards, no action, like the finish only market. I mentioned Mota's not a great finisher. Jim Miller obviously is one of the best finishers, if not the best finisher in UFC history. He's got like 23 professional finishes. So maybe get a plus 130 on the inside, or I should say the scorecards, no action line here with Jim Miller. So sounds like we both give the veteran a chance, especially to get it done early this weekend. John, you got a little more confidence on the money line than I do, but that's of course because it's your guy Jim Miller. So sounds like we're on the same page. A10 A10 John, for those guys listening, John throwing up the A10 sign for Jim Miller. But let's move on to the featured bout on the main card. We got Parker Porter minus 260 against Alan Badou, who comes back plus 210. It's funny to say that's a featured bout because it's really just kind of a shit show at heavyweight. Alan Badou, a guy who's kind of an inflated 205 or a guy who's made 205 in the past, especially his fights back on the Canadian regional scene, has come to the UFC. Kind of an inflated guy, I would say. Like, he probably can't make 205 anymore, but he's definitely not like a legitimate 265-pound guy like Parker Porter, who's probably going to weigh in above 260, north of 262, I think, in all his UFC fights come Saturday night. But Parker Porter, a guy we kind of make fun of due to his build, obviously struggled in that UFC debut, got put away pretty early by Chris Dawkins. I think it was in the first round. But since then, put on 2 decently impressive performances. Not great opponents in Josh Parisian and Chase Sherman, but a guy, Parker Porter, who we know is going to be able to go out there, throw 100 significant strikes, put on a pace at heavyweight, which is not something we see often. A guy who on the regional scene has a lot of power. Haven't seen it kind of come to fruition in terms of a UFC finish yet, but Porter, a big favorite this weekend against Badou. And Badou is like one of the worst to ever do it. I've been saying it since he got to the UFC. Like, he's decently athletic in round 1. He's pretty fast at heavyweight. That's kind of the pro of him being up at that weight class. But, grappling is really bad. He throws some strikes from weird angles, which, you could always catch someone at heavyweight, but I think he's pretty terrible anywhere the fight goes. I said that coming into his debut. Just a guy who I don't think belongs to this level. So Porter plus minus 260, I should say, sounds about right. Something I think is interesting is Porter's sub, which I've heard a few people mention to me this weekend. Hasn't really wrestled with a ton of success in the UFC, but has attempted 12 takedowns over his last 30 minutes inside the cage. I think Badou is clearly like the worst heavyweight grappler currently on the roster. So you get him down. I think the submission is probably not too far away. I will also say Alan Badou, notoriously a quitter, a guy who, when he's put in tough positions, is not necessarily going to get out of it. If he gets mounted, he's given his back and just ready to tap. He's one of those guys who's not going to go out there and really make it through adversity too often, I think. So I think Parker Porter maybe deals with a little trouble early, but minus 260 seems about right. I expect him to dominate down the stretch. John, your thoughts here on this heavyweight fight between Porter and Badou?
Yeah, you mentioned it. It's kind of a slop fest, and it's so funny when you hear like I put up that teaser tweet after the Super Bowl about Parker Porter and a guy that I have previously called Pork Chop Porter, which I will not refer to him as that anymore. Now that he's on a win streak, he's earned my respect. But seeing him at, multiple people were commenting like, you crazy price on Porter, but honestly, like it's warranted. Like Badou, you mentioned it, is like, I mean, there's nothing you can take away from him outside of like it's heavyweight. He can hit hard and maybe drop Porter. Like outside of that, I don't think he wins a decision. He absolutely is not winning by submission here. So it's like outside of a lucky punch, I don't see how Porter loses this one. And Porter's a guy, you mentioned it, like for heavyweight, like he could put on a pace, landed 149 significant strikes in a 3-round fight his last time out. Like he's just going to be throwing a ton more volume. Like you said, if he gets the fight to the fight to the ground, I do think a sub is live, but I also just think he might just like outbox him for 15 minutes or however long it lasts. And I don't think it lasts the full 15. I think Porter's a guy who, not necessarily like the one punch power knockout over Badou here, but I think it's more of like a death by 1,000 cuts. I think we see accumulation over the first round. Maybe Badou makes it out of the first round. He's looking a little shaky, and then round 2, he just absolutely just falls off a cliff, takes a nap, whatever. I think Porter gets a finish here. So and anything like I considered a round 2 prop on Porter, a round 3 even, but I doubt Badou makes it to round 3, even though the number's better there. But maybe I'll take a stab on a Porter round 2 instead of the Porter sub. I think they're both in play. I think they're both good. Whatever number's better, I'd say go with that one.
I think round 2 is about plus 500 right now. I got to double check the number on sub. I think it's a little bit higher than that round 2 is, but I looked at round 2 as well. Badou, when you mentioned like Porter's landed 149 strikes, like Alan Badou is not absorbing 149 149 strikes in a UFC fight. He will quit long before then, believe me on that one. Let's move on to the co-main event here. Fun fight. Jamie Pickett taking it on short notice as a plus 230 dog, 7.4K against Kyle Dawkins, who's minus 290, $8,800 for Dawkins, who's kind of had a weird stretch where, he submitted Kevin Holland and then it was overturned after the fact inside of the cage. He's had a bunch of fights fall out. He hasn't fought since October of last year, which isn't a long layoff, but when you consider the fact, we'd been waiting for this guy to fight for a long time. Weird circumstances for Dawkins. Gets a short notice opponent here in Jamie Pickett, Jamie Pickett, your boy, John, he's put together, maybe not your boy. He made you money once or twice. We appreciate him for that, but maybe stops being your boy this weekend. Pickett has won 2 in a row after dropping his first 2 UFC fights. John, I know we both have a fight here on the money line. I know it's a spot that you were excited about pretty much since the fight was announced late last week / early this week. So give me your thoughts here on Kyle Dawkins. I know you laid the chalk, and tell the people why.
Yeah, I told you I'm trying to get better about spots where I feel pretty confident in the favorite, and this is certainly one of them on Kyle Dawkins. I played him to win 1.5 units at minus 230 earlier in the week on FanDuel. I really like this matchup for Kyle Dawkins. You mentioned it, Jamie Pickett. I backed him in his previous 2 fights. He came through for us as an underdog against Laureano Staropoli. Ugly fight, Jamie Pickett style, ended up cashing a pretty big number there, and then backed him against Joseph Holmes. Felt really good about that spot. But both of those are really more of a fade on his opponent than it is like inspiring any type of confidence in Jamie Pickett. And I think matchups like are so important. And this one is like so beyond different than his previous 2 matchups to me. Like I know a lot of people are like, well, Pickett could maybe just do a lot of cage pushing, make it ugly, whatever. Like I really feel strongly he's not going to have anywhere near the type of success that he had doing that in those previous 2 fights against Kyle Dawkins. You look at the fight Kyle Dawkins against Brendan Allen or Phil Hawes. Like, those are much, much different matchups. Phil Hawes, collegiate wrestling background. Brendan Allen, good grappler. And Dawkins had moments in both of those fights. And, he had Hawes hurt. He even had Brendan Allen, backed up against the cage, and then it's like he tries to grapple when he clearly has a striking advantage. I just think he could win this fight no matter where it goes. I think he's going to minimum double up strikes on Pickett. Pickett's super low volume. I think Dawkins is durable enough where Pickett's like blitz baits the approach, where even if he lands something, like, he's not necessarily a one-punch power guy. He's got heavy leg kicks, but they're pretty telegraphed. And then, like, half the time, even when he's trying to be the aggressor and move forward, he's just waiting. Like, he'll push forward and just wait and look to counter. Like, he really doesn't have many tools against a guy like Kyle Dawkins here, who I think is going to double him up on volume. He's a much better striker. I think he's a much better grappler as well. I think if anybody's going to land takedowns here, I think Pickett might be able to land one takedown here, but it's like, that's if Dawkins doesn't mind going to the mat because he's the better grappler. And I think a submission's live for Dawkins as well. So I'm more than likely, I think we see a decision. I think it's probably Dawkins 30-27, but I think a submission is live too if he decides to go for takedowns, because grappling is, for whatever reason, his favorite thing to do, even when he does have a striking advantage. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this hit the mat, but no matter where the fight goes, I think Dawkins wins. So yeah, I feel pretty good about Dawkins, and I believe you do as well. So tell the people what they want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think you told the people what they want to hear, honestly. Like, I bet him a little bit earlier in the week than you did. I think at minus 215, but a little bit of a smaller bet. I think you said a unit and a half at minus 235. I just got a unit at minus 215 for Dawkins. I just think it's a very winnable fight for him for most of the reasons you outlined. I do think there's a scenario where there's a lot of cage pushing here, a lot of clinching against the fence. But Kyle Dawkins, I just think, is kind of better everywhere than Jamie Pickett is. Pickett's a guy who goes out there and he blitzes you, like you mentioned. If that doesn't work, he'll push you against the cage. I don't think he has great wrestling. Dawkins can get taken down, is kind of too happy, in my opinion, to play off his back. But, like, in terms of just technical striking, and more specifically, or not even more specifically, even more obviously, like, technical grappling, like, Dawkins is a way better grappler than Jamie Pickett. Like, I don't really know if it matters who takes the fight to the ground. And obviously you want your guy to, start in top position, start in a dominant position, especially when you're laying minus 215. But Dawkins is just way better at jiu-jitsu than Pickett is here. So plus 300 for the sub. I don't think there's a ton of value there. I think you're kind of guessing inside the distance or decision. I lean decision myself, but, like, wouldn't be shocked at all by a Dawkins stoppage. So I just laid it on the money line, man. I think there's value in that number up until about minus 235, minus 240 where you played it. And so we're each on Kyle Dawkins on the money line in the co-main event. We can move on now to the main event of the evening, which is now a 5-round fight. Just want to confirm that after the fact. It was 3 rounds and pushed up to 5, but it is 5. It's a main event this weekend at light heavyweight. Jamal Hill is minus 240 and $9,000 on DK against Johnny Walker, who comes back plus 195. 7.2K for Johnny Walker. And this is a fight where it's just a really easy pass for me. I don't want to bury the lead here, but Johnny Walker, a guy who is like the most light heavyweight fighter of all time. And what I mean by that is light heavyweight is a weight class that I always call it like the meme weight class. We see guys who have no real skills, who are either big or athletic or good at one thing, have just a lot of success at that weight class. And Johnny Walker, clearly a freak athlete, clearly a guy who possesses ton of ability to just end the fight in an instant, not even because he carries like a ton of power in his punches, but like what was Justin Ledet fight, hit him with a spinning back fist. The Khalil Roundtree elbow is like one of the most violent finishes I've ever seen. But he also has these massive flaws in his game where we've seen him get knocked out like 4 times in one fight on the regional scene. That video has been circulating again this week. I always make sure to watch it on Johnny Walker Fight Weeks. But he's also a guy who, like, last fight we saw him just randomly against Thiago Santos at a new camp. Johnny Walker was throw like no output and kind of get rid of everything that made him good, which was his ability to just kind of overwhelm opponents and look at them and hit them with all these weird different angles and different strikes I haven't seen before. So tough to know what's coming for Johnny Walker. Jamal Hill, I think, is a deserved favorite. I've tried to fade Jamal Hill in the past, even against Jimmy Crute. I do think that Jamal Hill is a guy who we haven't seen a ton of him off of his back. We've seen him getting taken down in some fights before, but in terms of like a pure boxing match, which I think Johnny Walker is going to give him, or a pure kickboxing match, I think Jamal Hill is able to cover minus 250 against a lot of guys in this division, but 5 rounds, we've never really seen him go there before. I suspect his cardio is pretty good. He has the ability to put on a decent amount of volume at light heavyweight. So I'll pick Jamal Hill, but like it would not shock me if Johnny Walker pulls off a highlight this weekend. Nothing would really shock me here. Minus 250 and Jamal Hill seems about right. I would need a pretty big edge to bet on this fight. It just kind of feels like some wonky shit waiting to happen. So no bet for me here, John. Anything for you in the main event, my friend?
Yeah, I actually, I guess I feel a little bit better about the Jamal Hill side. I have him closing out a 3-leg parlay. My 3 guys I played was Pierce, Dawkins, who's obviously our star fighter this week that we both love, and then Jamal Hill. And the reason why is because Johnny Walker sucks. And I think anybody who has interest in betting Johnny Walker should be forced to watch that fight that you referred to where he gets knocked out like 4 times by some regional bum. But yeah, I mean, he had a great run. It's over. He had the first, what was it? His first 3 fights in the UFC.
People thought he was going to beat Jon Jones. People thought he was going to beat Corey Anderson. He was a favorite versus Corey Anderson.
I'm willing to accept that I may have tweeted a hype tweet about Johnny Walker at one point. It was that like house text house that says in this house, and it says we root for Johnny Walker, and that was for the Corey Anderson fight. Obviously didn't go great, but yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like Johnny Walker, super athletic, super explosive, another guy, probably first round knockout or bust. And whether that means, regardless that he's changed his approach with John Kavanagh, where they're trying to turn him into like this reserved technical point fighter, it's just not going to happen. That's not who he is. He can't fight that game. We saw that in the Santos fight. It was literally a staring match. And even like coming in with that reserved approach, like the cardio still didn't look great. Like he literally should just go back to what he was, where he's either going to have crazy good finishes where he just lands something big, and he's super capable to do that. But outside of that, like, I mean, there's so many holes in his game. The durability, huge red flag. You mentioned he's been knocked out multiple times, been hurt multiple other times as well. Like he does not have a good chin. But then also like outside of the durability, we know he can get taken down. We know he's not good on his back. We know his cardio is not good. How does he win outside of an early knockout, outside of landing a big punch? And even in some of the fights where he does land a big punch, he's getting hurt before that, like the Ryan Spawn fight, where it's like literally just 2 guys knocking each other out at the same time. Like, it was just unbelievable, man. So I really don't think he's that good. I think if you're backing Jamal Hill, you're just fading a Johnny Walker athletic big shot early, because outside of that, Hill's the better striker. He's got much better durability, and I think he probably has better cardio, even though I doubt he needs it here, because I don't think this one lasts longer than, say, 2 rounds, maybe 3 at most. But I like the Jamal Hill side. I feel pretty good about him. The last thing I'll say is, in terms of DraftKings, like, you definitely want to get exposure to both sides. As much as I just said Johnny Walker is a can, basically, which obviously I'm being a little bit dramatic there, but as much as I just said all that, like, obviously the upside on DraftKings you cannot deny, because in a win, similar to Alhassan, it's likely coming by a first round knockout. So you want that type of upside, especially at his price on DraftKings. I'll have exposure to both sides. Lean towards Hill. The parlay's closing out Hill. I feel good about Hill, but I'm not just completely writing off Johnny Walker's upside on DraftKings.
That makes sense. It sounds like you have a little bit of a stronger opinion on the main event than I do. That's all 12 fights for this weekend. John, if you have anything you want to add about the DK slate in general, any fight we talked about that something we missed, but feel free to do so. And if not, take us out of here, my man.
Yeah, I think we covered it pretty well. I know the card isn't the best quality, but it should be a fun DraftKings slate. We're back in the Apex. I think we see a lot of finishes this week. We talked through like 4 or 5 fights where we're like, yeah, we're expecting a finish, even a bet or 2 where we are betting on a finish. So I think it'll be a fun card, even though the level of quality isn't really necessarily that great. But let's be honest, we're all going to be watching it anyway. But that's it, guys. One last thing I'll say is, I am trying to improve my production skills. We're doing some things a little bit differently, if you guys haven't noticed. More things to come in the future once I figure out all that on the tech and production side of things. But I'm learning as I go. Bear with us. Big things coming. But appreciate it, guys. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I'm John Kelly. That's Jonah Shiffman. This is the Undisputed MMA Show presented by the FTN Network.